Hi, everyone, and welcome to Barracuda's Below the Surface. My name is Alessia Klevchuk, and I'm a product marketing director here at Barracuda. So I'm joined here today by Fleming, Asaf, and Miriam to talk about the state of cybersecurity in 2022 and their predictions for 2023. But before we get started, let's do a quick round of introductions of our guests. Let's start with you, Fleming. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm the CTO at Barracuda. My name is Fleming Shi. I joined the company quite a while ago. Gone through multiple transitions and how we are seeing our products stay very close to our customers' journey. Glad to be here talking about 2023. So looking forward to have energetic conversation. Yep.
Great. What about you, Miriam?
Hey everyone, my name is Miriam Khalid. I'm the Senior SOC Manager of Offensive Security. I manage the XDR SOC, so we're the front line of all the incidents and the breaches that happen within our partners. I've been with Barracuda XDR for about 4 years. I'm excited to bring you guys all the stats and all of the things that we see in the front lines.
And Asaf.
Hey everyone, my name is Asaf Sadon. I'm a professor at Columbia, and before that I was doing research on security, and before that I was several years at Barracuda. So I ran our email protection product when I was there, and now I'm still kind of working with Barracuda, and I'm an advisor and doing all kinds of fun research projects together with the team at Barracuda.
Very good. Welcome, everyone. So let's get started. Let's get started by looking back at the past year and the cybersecurity trends of 2022. What stands out the most to you about cybersecurity, and what some of the key trends do you think are coming in 2023? Asaf, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think one of the really fascinating trends is kind of the breaches that are affecting what you may call as the gatekeepers of the key keepers of the security industry, right? So, for example, breaches that affected single sign-on providers such as Okta and password managers like LastPass, and providers, kind of identity protection advisors like LifeLock, right? So these are kind of the companies that we all trust with our identity, with our keys, and even they get breached. And obviously, when these types of organizations are breached, it can be pretty severe because they may hold the authentication keys for effectively, let's say if you're an organization, for basically all the products, all the software services that you use, and so that is something, right, that is I think historically we would always say it's always a good idea not to manage your own passwords, not to manage your keys. Perhaps go with one of these types of providers, and I think that is still the case. But that shows you that you really need multiple layers of defense. That, for example, authentication is not the end all. You can't just rely, let's say, on a single. If you use a single sign-on provider, it doesn't mean that basically you're secure. Everything, that all your systems are safe, that an attacker can't get in. So that's one really big trend we're seeing.
Yeah, Miriam, I think you're like in the front line of defense for this. Is this? Do you see some of these attacks? How the organization deal with them?
So we're actually coming out with a global threat report soon. It's going to be Barracuda's annual first global threat report, and in one of the sections, we actually talk about like the top companies that are getting breached, and a lot of them are SaaS and service providers. So that's because that's, as Asaf said, that it's like a golden gate for all other organizations. So we are seeing a lot of these MSPs or like SaaS companies get targeted, and a lot of them are just very basics, right? It takes only one user to get compromised, to compromise the whole network, or it takes only one asset to not be monitored on your network to be kind of like the gate into their network. So a lot of this we're seeing day in, day out. And also, like, one of the other trends, or what actually stood out in 2022, was the emergence of like cyber warfare, right, between Russia and China. I think that was like a huge wake-up call for the world, because it had global impact, right? There were companies or organizations coming in support of China and Ukraine. And there were ATP groups that were either coming in support, and they were targeting organizations that would support either side. So we saw a lot of different type of tactics and techniques come into play in 2022.
Yes, for sure. So definitely the physical, also the physical war turning into this digital sabotage that we are starting to see. Fleming, I think you might have some ideas about that, right?
Yeah, definitely. When the physical war broke out, we saw attacks on critical infrastructure across, various different parts of the world, because I think they're trying to cause, pain that goes beyond just the immediate victim, that goes actually translate to the entire, basically population of under attack in that way. Also, think about the sabotages. They're much more destructive, right? So you're looking at taking out the entire network or systems that make it so difficult to operate. So you have to have a stronger in disaster recovery kind of plan, like having your recovery time objectives and point objectives really set up so your business can function and can return to normal. And it's interesting. 2022 is like that, and I think going to 2023, based on what we have seen, is probably going after software vendors, software supply chain. These are all new vectors that basically causing a lot of havoc for many businesses, because you don't need to click on a link anymore. They probably compromised enough credentials to target your infrastructure and get into your system and do the takedowns the way they have. So have to be really ready for that kind of attacks. Yeah,
for sure. So thinking ahead onto 2023, there any other trends that you think is going to be coming? What can we expect from 2023?
I can go first, no problem. So the way I see it, just as Asaf kind of touched on, right? So the gatekeepers are getting taken down, right? So you end up with more leakage, and unfortunately, from 2004 to now, as a global, I would just say, as the entire world have lost about 18 billion pieces of record, and which means that the amount of data we have lost to the bad guys is substantial, and that seems to continue. And not only they compromise your environment, like in the scenario, like a password manager, they take the PII, right? Because then now they know they don't have to get to the password, because the password could be encrypted and it will take years to unencrypt it by the bad guys. But what they have gotten is the sites that's associated to a user or to the customers, and they can use other passwords to challenge that, because credential stuffing is pretty easy. They can run a bot through it, and they can actually try all the weak passwords and likely already exist in another breach in the past. So this is what I see is where we have to really kind of get to the passwordless world, which is probably going to rely on some level of device trust, which like trust platform module that in every mobile device or every laptop could be used to validate users. Biometrics will be used, and hopefully we get to a place where password is not scary anymore. You don't have to constantly change it and creating this unfortunately super easy spot for the bad guys. So hopefully we get to that part, and the vendors are out there building these solutions. So look forward to 2023 with a better answer. Yeah.
So I can make a bold prediction for 2023. I think, and this is something we're really trying to wrap our heads around, kind of looking forward where new attacks and new defenses are going to come from, is the emergence of large language models, obviously, which everybody I think has been talking about and maybe experimenting with tools like ChatGPT. I personally believe that they're going to be, unfortunately, very, very potent tools for attackers. The ability to impersonate a human and sound like a human with very high fidelity, and even have an entire conversation with a target that actually makes complete sense, is very dangerous in the realm of security. It lowers the barrier for attackers even more than it was already low. Like it was already not that complicated to impersonate a company CEO and send an email to the CFO, but now it's going to be even worse, right? You're going to be able to do this automatically, maybe even craft a personalized email to the CFO, maybe even craft an automated phishing site that looks exactly like the company's website or something, and even have a whole back and forth with the CFO without a human being involved, right? So you can just imagine the power of these things. On the bright side, I also think there's just a phenomenal opportunity for security providers to also take advantage of these techniques, right? At Barracuda, for example, I think we're one of the first, if not the first company to really incorporate like AI into email detection. But the advance, in the tools available has just been so rapid, especially in the area of natural language processing, which actually lagged behind other areas of AI for many years. So I think, on the one hand, attackers are going to get more sophisticated, but on the other hand, I think also the ability to prevent and detect these attacks is also going to get a very serious upgrade. So I think it's, as usual in security, it's going to be a cat and mouse game, but I think it's going to be a really fascinating one. And I think 2023 is going to be the year where it really, I think it's going to really heat up.
Yeah. To add to that, I think CVEs and critical vulnerabilities are going to be huge going into 2023. Like, for example, towards the end of last year in 2022, we had about 21,000 critical CVEs, and many of them were critical. And like, for example, you have many of them that allow authentication to a firewall without needing credentials, right? So the need of even having credentials that are lost is not gonna be sufficient anymore because these vulnerabilities exist. So I think what organizations are really gonna have to do is be on top of all the zero days and vulnerabilities that are being released and patching them as soon as they can.
Yeah, so great predictions, and I think there's a lot to unpack actually there. And these predictions are great. And if you think about it, like as an individual, as a IT professional, what do you do? Saf, for example, you talked about how hackers will start using the AI to create these attacks, and some of the content, some of the things that can be created looks just like a human interaction. That it's so much better than just going and researching it yourself. What can organizations do to protect themselves? What should they have in place to make sure that they can identify what's an attack and what's not when it's so?
I think the usage of machine learning and AI detections will probably become one of the best practices in security, right? So being able to detect what's abnormal and what's not abnormal in a data set.
So using the AI to fight the AI.
Yeah, I also think it is really fascinating, but there's some silver lining. The reason for that is people who are using ChatGPT for a purpose of like writing some code that cracks open certain sites, people are watching, right? Like it's not like they're just using the tool in their private. The reason I think ChatGPT is powerful is because all the hyperscalers behind it, right? It requires a lot of data sources, more of a general AI kind of approach. So it becomes super smart, but it's not contained in an environment where no one's seeing it. So I do feel like as responsible technology providers out there, when tools are provided like this, having some proper auditing and tracking, it will be helpful. The other thing I feel like that's really interesting is I want to call out all the SaaS vendors who are building SaaS applications. The reason for that is provide security controls in your SaaS application for data, for access, for multi-factor, all those things, and including multiple roles that you can provide through your SaaS application. The reason for that is because in the past, security was done on the perimeter, right? People accessing your network and going from there, accessing your assets. But in the future, most people are adopting SaaS everywhere. And in that way, they're actually using your application and storing customer data. So if you provide security controls through APIs, and we will be able to, like, security vendors can interact with those APIs just as much as we did with the cloud providers, right? There's a thing called the Cloud Security Posture Management, which is designed for managing the infrastructure securely. Don't leave your keys, in a wrong place, or leaving the ports open. That's the infrastructure. But your SaaS application, if you're a builder for a SaaS application, I will call them out to make your security stronger, make it API that's available to vendors. Then we can instrument all those APIs. The reason for that, most of the problems are done to misconfiguration, right? Some people use the SaaS, they forgot to turn on MFA. That's really terrible, right? If you think about it that way. But if their misconfiguration and policy drift or configuration drifts are usually the places where the bad guys are betting on to get into your environment. In this case, SaaS is being adopted a lot. So I would ask folks to pay attention to that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I can. I kind of completely agree with Miriam and Fleming's advice. And just add to that, like, I think even as attacks evolve, right, and these new vulnerabilities appear, I think that the same old adage that probably you've heard, people like us repeat time over time is defense in depth, right? I think this just highlights, like, the vulnerabilities, for example, of these SaaS providers and supply chain vulnerabilities. Just shows that you really can't just rely on one. There isn't one end all solution, right, to security. So it's from, like using AI, smart intelligent detection, right? Like Miriam said, like AI-based tools. So of course you want to do that. It's also from auditing, as Fleming said, right, or the ability to, after an attack has happened, to do forensics and make sure you shut down all the vulnerabilities and make sure the attacker is not sitting on your network anymore, sitting on any accounts. And it's also about backing up, right, your data, so that if you do get ransomware or systems go down, you get DDoSed, you're able to quickly come back up. And then finally, it's also all about the humans, right? As much as we obviously, I think, all of us like to geek out about really cool technology tools to these problems. At the end of the day, if someone sends an email to your CFO, hey, can you wire some money? And if the CEO, they just like does it, right, without, hey, where's this email coming from? Or maybe I should get on the phone with this person, or maybe we should have some tighter controls around money transfer. There's kind of no security solution that's gonna be 100% be able to kind of automatically flag that. So it's really also important to set up, effective training programs and kind of internal controls. So I think, again, there's no one magic bullets. You really have to have a whole kind of program. And I don't think, the rise of AI doesn't change that, right? These same set of tools are still going to be there to stop attackers.
I think it really starts at the individual level, right? So everyone being educated about what's a phishing attack, right? What's a credential stuffing attack? Like the security awareness training, I think, will be a must going into 2023.
Yeah, training use is always important, and a last line of defense that if you don't train them, that's it. Like they can really help out. We've seen a lot of positive results. I know we've done a lot of research showing that if you train your users, if you train your employees, they can really make a huge difference. But I think one of the cybersecurity trends of 2022 that we haven't actually quite touched on is supply chain attacks like Log4j. What impact did that have, and how do you see this kind of threats evolving over time?
Yeah, I just want to say these types of attacks are, if you think about it, they're so frustrating, right? Like you could be like perfect, right? I don't know, you have, like, let's say you have everything together, your company, your IT team, instituted like really comprehensive programs, right? You got SSO, you got MFA, you have the best email security backup, right? Firewall, you have like kind of everything is firewalled, locked down, and then one of the products you use, right, has a vulnerability. So, right, and it's not even that's it's. I think this is just unfortunately, right, this is the reality we live in right now, that it's not all you don't have 100% control. Of course, it's important again to evaluate the vendors you kind of go in business with, but some of these attacks are just gonna happen, right? So it's just I think we feel your pain, right?
Yeah.
With these types of attacks.
I think with Log4j specifically, the impact was enormous. Just to like throw some stats out there were about 88% of all organizations were affected, and about 3 billion devices were affected. And in the SOC today, we still see the effects of it, right? So we've actually handled incidents where people have used the Log4j vulnerability to deploy crypto miners on devices, right? So we've had to kind of combat that by creating detections where the CPU is high. And these threat actors are really smart. They actually turn the crypto miner off right when the CPU pings, so they can actually go under the radar. So the effects of Log4j, I believe, will probably go into 2023.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Log4j is used by a lot of developers in all different languages in some ways, but Java is a huge population of software assets out there. So,
Yeah. Well, one other topic that I think we talk about every single year is ransomware, because it's always making headlines. It's never going away, and it's just evolving, right? Like it's the same attack, just in a different way. So what changes have you noticed in the past year? How has that evolved?
I think with ransomware, it's interesting because we actually saw in ransomware incidents towards the end of the year. So towards like December and November, it basically there was like a 70% increase. And that's because these threat actors know people are on holidays, right? They know there's not all people on shift, or like their priority isn't security, right? Because it's the holidays. So they actually use that as advantage. And there's been like emergence of a lot of new ransomware groups, such as like Hive, Royal, Tommy Leaks, and they all use the same methods to get into your network, right? Internet facing assets, remote access services like open ports, MFA, like no MFA on VPN, misconfigured applications. So I think ransomware, year over year will probably be the top security threat to organizations.
Yeah. And I think ransomware used to be a lot more clear what the bad guys want, but now I feel like it has gotten beyond extortion. It's getting into doxing and getting into all the different ways of disrupt your business and your brand and your reputation, right? So unfortunately, it's almost like like it's business outcome they're looking at. Is almost like a long-term relationship, unfortunately, you end up having with the bad guys. And I also see insurances are actually paying a lot of attention to that, because they can't keep on paying these ransom payments and expect to survive, right? So their instinct is to use compliance and security upfront to actually drive better behavior. And I think that's a good thing. So my hope is in the new year, folks are able to get their incident response capabilities up. And if you don't have staffing or resources, you can always reach out to your MSP or MSSP to work with someone like Miriam or a team like Miriam to help you defend yourself. So I think there is a shift of how you can get access to best tools and best resources to defend yourself. So there's some good news there.
Yeah, and one other thing, this kind of goes back to, I think, one of the first things we talked about, right? A lot of ransomware originates from Russia, and I think potentially, as Russia becomes more and more isolated, right, this is a way, and we know that there are strong government ties to ransomware gangs there. This is a way to extract revenue from from organizations sitting, for example, in Western countries, right? So I think part of the rise that we're seeing is definitely tied to some of these, to the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical events.
Asaf, you're right on that, because remember, North Korea was already isolated, and North Korea had a lot of ransomware gangs, and I think Russia is just a bigger and more potent version of all that, and unfortunately, we might be facing that kind of situation.
Right. So there's another question on this. So we talked a little bit about the use of AI, and now we talk about the ransomware as well. And there is the use of AI kind of makes it easier somewhat it's a lot more accessible in some ways. You can use some of this readily available technologies to create some of the attacks, maybe. Ransomware, there is a ransomware as a service. So does do all of these things kind of lower entry for hackers to create these attacks? Would that mean there will just be more of this kind of things because there is more attacks? You don't need to be as sophisticated technically to launch and create some of this?
Yeah, Alyssa, can I add one more enabling quote unquote technology here? Is cryptocurrency. Okay,
yes.
So Bitcoin, right, is a haven for cyber attacks, right? If you think about it, without cryptocurrencies, it's actually quite a problem to actually get them, like with ransomware, it actually, it's kind of I don't even entirely know what attackers would do, right? It's not that easy to I think companies would also be much more reluctant to wire transfer money, let's say to North Korea, if it was actually dollars, right? So I think that's definitely another key technology that criminals have been using for their purposes. So and just to answer your question, I absolutely agree that the barrier to entry has lowered and lowered, and you have all these tools. And also in practice, I think the other thing that's going on is because organizations are so online, right? Like especially post-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID, that they're also very used to conducting business online and again, moving, like the CFO or the accounting team doesn't go to the office anymore. So, maybe they don't have, hey, is this, what about that deal? Are we, we owe them money. You don't have these like in-person interactions anymore, right? So everybody's just, or e-commerce websites, we're buying everything online, right? So I think just the victims are so used to operating in this online fashion that, it's very easy to execute these attacks. You don't even need like some hacker lab, right? Reverse engineer lab anymore, right? You can just hire a couple of teenagers to craft some clever emails, right? And you could like deceive, some of the world's most sophisticated organizations. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we all kind of contend with. And again, unfortunately, with AI, I think that entry, that barrier is even lower.
Yeah.
Just to add to Asaf's point on cryptocurrency, I think yes, there are ways to track it, the wallets, and we have seen some recovery in the past. But there's new cryptocurrencies out there, like that basically it's harder to track, right? So it's an evolution in that setup in a way, unfortunately, enables the bad guys. But I think, from my perspective, the tools such as AI tools, they don't have to use ChatGPT, right? It doesn't have to be that explicit. They have access to Spark. They have access to open source tools and all those things. They can train their models, and they can figure out, if there's a vulnerability like Marian touched on, it gets announced, how quickly a particular organization patch their environment, right? They can track the behavior just as much as we can track their behavior. So I think it's a battle with almost equal amount of weapons. But I think at the end of the day is cover all bases and understand the different attack vectors and how you can short circuit early, because part of the whole concept of XDR, which stands for Extended Detection and Response, is so you can respond quickly when something looks abnormal, so you don't have to end up at the point where you're dealing with insurance and payments, right? So I think that's key.
Yeah. Also, one of the things that we actually see in our SOC is cryptojacking. And that could be simply as like going to a website and that website installing a malicious script and injecting some sort of ad on the victim's computer, and they can then use those resources to mine cryptocurrency. So cryptojacking is actually one of like the top incidents that we have to deal with within the SOC.
Yeah.
Because it's so accessible from the internet. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of compute power they're hungry for sure.
So I think one last question that I have for you is, if you were to give one kind of key of advice for 2023 for the organizations, what would that be? What kind of technology, what kind of processes should they have in place, or anything to watch out for? Miriam, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think my one advice would probably be having a 24/7, 365 monitoring solution in place, right? That's monitoring all your assets, having email protection, EDR, also security awareness, educating all of your employees. I mean, there's a million different security tactics and like processes that organization can use, but if all their assets are being monitored, I think that's a good starting point.
Great. Asaf?
Yes, I think, based on kind of everything we've talked about today, I think, breaches are inevitable, unfortunately, whether to your organization or to, as we said, even some software that's used in your organization that you're not even aware of, right? Because because you bought it. So I think given that, I think having a preemptively setting up incident response tools and plans is critical, right? And kind of gaming out all these scenarios. What happens when a ransomware attack hits? What do we do? What happens if we discover a breach? What happens if an email account gets hijacked and starts spewing out email everywhere, right? So once you have a battle plan for these different scenarios, it doesn't mean that these scenarios they may very well occur, but your team is going to be much more prepared, and also the company's management, the company's board, kind of set the expectation for when things happen. What do we do? I think that's extremely useful from organizations that I've spoken with.
Yeah, for sure. So not just prevention, detection and response to those threats, right? Fleming, what do you have to add?
Yeah, well, I think in light of all the breaches in all the years that we have gone through, try to stay ahead of credential theft by actually start thinking about zero trust based, security, right? So basically provide, a solution that allows you to have, control over devices and their posture, and because credentials are already out there, so implement passwordless. I think in light of all that, I think implement passwordless as well as zero trust based access to your SaaS applications and your infrastructure will be the one thing that I would recommend.
Right. Well, thank you all for joining us. That's all we have time for today. Visit barracuda.com to view our past episodes, and until next time, thank you.